Namaste. Welcome to India. So do you know what it means? That's the most common form of greeting in India. Although we have a lot of other greetings, but this is like everybody understands it. And to understand the meaning of Namaste, once you understand it, you would understand Hinduism. So in simple terms, what it means is, we Hindus believe that part of the universal soul, whom we call the God, resides in every living being. So when we say Namaste, it's a sort of two words, Namo Astate, so which means the God in me recognizes the God in you and bows in front of the God in you. So when you say Namaste, you bend a little. So it's kind of humbling and you're recognizing the God in the other person. So that's what it all means. So Namaste. Yeah. So welcome to India. So before really telling you about the itinerary, what we are going to do, so let's have a little introduction session. So maybe I'll give it a start. I'll personally introduce myself and then we'll have a little... Well, if you don't understand me, you can always ask me to repeat. My accent is different. I tend to go a little fast at times, like most Indians when talking in English. So you can always ask me to repeat. Yeah, so my name is Devendra Singh Guleria. Quite a tongue twister for you, but my friends call me Dev, so that's easy for you. So call me Dev, no problem. I consider you all my friends. I come from north of India, foothills of mountains, Himalayan ranges. The region is called Himachal Pradesh, which is just south of Kashmir in north. So it's foothills of the Himalayas, from a tiny little village. But I've not really lived much there, as my father was in Indian Army. So I've spent my growing up years moving around with him, Every 2-3 years we were in a different city, different location, within the country only though. So I am, as they call, the army brat actually. I grew up as a very confused youngster. I'm a science graduate, followed it up with a management degree. Didn't know what to do, and well, anyhow, management graduate, so tried to climb the corporate ladder. And a few years down the line, I realized I'm not really cut out for a regular corporate kind of profile, so gave it up, started my own recruitment agency. Was doing okay, but it became too monotonous. For 4 years or so, I was not enjoying it again. And that was around the time when I met this old college friend of mine after maybe 8 years or so, who was already in this travel industry. And this is one industry which always kind of used to fascinate me, but I don't know why I never thought of getting into this industry. And there was this friend, he started talking about me, what he does, and it sounded really fantastic idea, and I was bored and I was just looking to do something else. And anyhow, he goes back, and a few days later I got a call from him, and he said, hey, I have this American friend who's coming to India and he wants a local tour. And I said, okay, so what can I do? I said, why not you do it? And I said, I have never done it before and I hardly know about my country, and how do you expect me to do justice? He said, no, I know you can do it. And so that's how I was with him for 2 days. And although I don't think I did a good job, but I think he didn't know much about India. His feedback was good. Feedback was good, and he rated me exceptional, and that's how my journey started. And here I am. This is 8th year in travel trade, 4th year with boat, standing in front of you as a trip leader. Coming to India, we say it's not a vacation, it's an experience. You need a vacation afterwards. So after 2 weeks, you're going to need a vacation. The driver's name is Subhash, S-U-B-H-A-S-H. The assistant's name is Tara Chand, but you can call him Tara, T-A-R-A.
So we'll start with the mosque, followed by bicycle rickshaw ride, and then we'll do the Rajghat, place where father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, was cremated. So that's a shrine. Your visit to India is incomplete without paying homage to Mahatma Gandhi. So any famous dignitary, all American presidents who have been to India, that's the first place they visit when they arrive in India. So little snapshot about India. I think some of the figures, some of the stats you're already clear about. We are a country of 1.22 billion people, but that's the last census which was held a few years back. So probably we are already 1.25 billion people. We are roughly one-third the area compared to US, but 3 times the population. The mix, little over 80% of the population is Hindu. Around 14%, little less than 14% as per the official estimate are Muslims. 14% means over 150 million Muslims living in India. So we are also probably country with third largest Muslim population in the world. And we have the largest number of mosques in the world also. Little over 2% are Christians, just under 2% are Sikhs. I'm sure you know about Sikhs. Under 1% are Buddhists, and around 0.5% or so Jains. Then rest are other minorities like a few Jews also, and Parsis, or ethnically Parsis, and other Baha'is. Almost 40% of the world's population of Baha'is lives in India. Literacy rate is around 74% or so. Life expectancy is 67. Agriculture still happens to be the majority occupation of the country. Well, let me put it this way. All Sikhs wear turbans, but all turbanators are not Sikhs necessarily. To wear a turban, but there's a different style in which they wear it. But there are quite a few Hindu communities, especially in the countryside, and also some Muslims wear different styles of turbans. In fact, a long time back, it was a social custom, it was an important part of dressing up, wearing a turban for Hindus, and by looking at the size and the way it was tied around, you could tell which community or caste a person came from. And in Rajasthan, in the countryside, actually, even now, it's by looking at the turban, you can tell which caste that person belongs to. So it's like they implement it pretty strictly. If you wear being a particular caste, and if you wear the style of turban of some other community, you can be ostracized, or people can actually. The color of the turban for Sikhs, no significance. They wear it matching their clothes. But for Hindus, in those times, different colors for different occasions or festivals or seasons. Majority of the population still is engaged in agriculture in India. 50% plus population is engaged in agriculture. Around 26-27% in the service industry and 20-21% in the industry. But major contributor to GDP is service industry, which is like 60% plus. Agriculture just contributes 14% or so. In 1950s, when we gained independence, agriculture used to contribute maybe 80%. to the GDP. So from 80% to just 14%. But because it employs the largest section of the population, that's still very important industry for us. During our trip, you are going to see people feeding all sorts of living things: pigeons, dogs, cows, pigs, monkeys. So that again comes from a religion. They believe that part of the universal soul, Dev, resides in every living being. So feeding any form of living being is considered good deed or good karma. Have you heard the word karma? Karma is a Hindi word for a good deed, a way to salvation. So that's why you see Hindus feeding all sorts of living beings. So probably India has world's largest population of most of the stray animals you can think about. Right from cats to dogs to pigs to monkeys, pigeons. Now the second question is about tourism. How important the tourism is for India? Well, unfortunately, it still plays a very minuscule role in the economy of the country, although our country has almost everything to offer, right from history to culture to beaches to mountains in north of India, a huge variety of wildlife. We have ski resorts in north of India. Did you know that? We do have that. So we have a desert in India, which is west of Jaipur, the second city in the itinerary. But it's just that we have, for some reason, not been able to put our act together and really put in a concerted effort. But luckily, our current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, have you heard of him? He was in US as soon as he was elected the PM, and if Indian media's reports are to be believed, he was a big hit in America. Was he? So he is according a lot of importance to tourism, and on every forum he never fails to talk about tourism and how important it can be for a country like India with such a huge population, and tourism employs, it's such a huge employment generator. It's believed a single American like you coming to India would provide direct or indirect employment to at least 5 people. There are already 3 you are employing. Quite a few in the hotel, the taxi driver, the assistant who receives you at the airport, the shopkeepers who sell various stuff to you. Well, talking about the total share in the world's tourism industry, we are just 0.5 or 0.6% actually. Traditionally, it was always UK which used to be the biggest source market for us. But last year, total number of Americans exceeded English. In fact, more than 1 million Americans visited India last year. So thank you to all of you. So all the paperwork, judiciary, police departments used to work in English only. So after we gained independence, the aim was to continue using English and slowly replace it with Hindi, maybe in 15 years' time. But in 1964 or 65, when the time came to phase out English and make Hindi as a national language, there was a great opposition, violent clashes actually, because Hindi is primarily viewed as North and West Indian language. The South Indian states and East Indian states, they feel it's being imposed on them, so they could never do it. Hindi is not spoken by more than 40% of the population of India. In currency also you see a lot of languages, So it's basically a constitution recognizes 18 languages as official languages, and then another 1,600 language groups actually. 1652 is the exact number to be precise. No foreign language as such, but one is the dialect of the area I come from. One is the dialect of the area I live in now, Jaipur, Rajasthan. Then Punjabi language, Hindi, and English of course. And all of them made Delhi as their capital. So each of these dynasties founded their own capital within this larger region which we call Delhi. So whole city is full of these old scattered ruins spread in an area of around 1,200 square miles or so. The ASI, Archaeological Survey of India, lists more than 1,000 heritage structures in the city, and 150 of them are listed as of national importance. If you had come to Delhi 10 years back, it was crazy traffic. If you had to go from one end of the city to another, you would plan months in advance because it would take 3-4 hours to cover a distance of. It runs 6 lines, radial lines connecting the whole city. But they're still adding some more lines which are connecting these radial lines actually. More than probably 150 metro stations, and it covers a distance of around 120 miles. In the old city it's underground, in the new part of the city it's elevated and this is the part of the city where you'll come if you want to buy stuff really cheap. But it's also of cheap quality. Eight different dynasties ruling the country in last 10 centuries or so. So 8 different cities, capital cities, which were founded in this very region which we call Delhi now. So out of these 8 cities, the 7th dynasty or the 7th city was founded by the Mughals. Mughals were a dynasty, Muslims who came from area around Uzbekistan, Samarkand in early 16th century, more as invaders. The first emperor in the line of Mughals, Babur, he was ruling Afghanistan for a while, Kabul. And Kabul was the area from which these camel caravans, laden with precious, semi-precious stones, cotton, silk, spices, used to pass through because it was part of the Silk Route. So he had heard about the famed riches of India from these traders. So he thought, it's good. He was in need of resources. Although Afghanistan is beautiful, but no natural resources there. So that's how he initially came to India in search of that wealth. But around the time when he came to India, specifically in Delhi, there was a power vacuum. There was a dynasty called Lodhis who were ruling, but there was a lot of infighting going on for supremacy, for succession amongst brothers and cousins. So they saw an opportunity and slowly occupied the city and over a period of time consolidated their power, and they ruled India for almost 200 years before the British took over in 18th century. So from middle of 16th century, 1550s to early 1700s, Mughals were ruling the country. So Mughal is nothing but a corrupt version of the word Mongol. So they were Mongolian by descent, but they had settled around Uzbekistan area for almost 2 centuries before they came to India. So initially they never liked to call themselves Mongols. They used to call themselves Timurids or descendants of Timur the Lame. Yeah, but it was the British for the first time who called them Mughals. And then they were called the Mughal dynasty only. So initially Mughals ruled from Agra, which remained the imperial capital for almost 100 years. But in 1639, the Emperor Shah Jahan, the same emperor who built the Taj Mahal we are going to explore in Agra, he decided to shift the capital from Agra to Delhi for strategic reasons. So he founded a city here which was called Shah Jahanabad. So So Shahjahan for Shahjahan, Abad for population. So population of Shah Jahan. And it was the richest and most prosperous cities of India in the middle of 17th century. Beautifully laid out. There used to be water fountains connecting the fort with this main market. But in 1947, when India gained independence from the British rule and the country was divided into Pakistan and India, those massive migrations of Hindus and Sikhs from Pakistan, most of them landed in Delhi, and all of them took refuge in this area only. So all the old structures were demolished, and it developed more as a shanty town in those times.
Oh yeah, strong people. So enjoy the ride. I'm going to meet you right there in maybe 20-25 minutes. आराम से घुमाओ जब तक खुले नहीं वो ठीक है? If you want to slow them down somewhere, you can just tap the shoulder and they'll slow down. If you want to photograph something or
बार स्कैन कर देते हैं बार आओ जी
का नुकसान खुद होगा और मैं बोल दूंगा अभी डिजाइन जो है रेडी भी नहीं हुई है डिजाइन रेडी करने में कल
हमारे नाम से तो हमें ही देना पड़ेगा भैया बना ले जा रहे हैं यार रोज यहाँ पे खड़ा हुआ है आराम से नंबर लगा देखो लेके लाचे का क्या हुआ तेरी दुकान से पहले चल जरा जल्दी से आगे रे भाई लोग कौन रे भाई देखो कितना आगे का हां
He needs a polka dot shirt.
Listen to me for a while, few minutes. So here we are. It's called the Jama Masjid, or Masjid is for the Muslim mosque, and Jama Friday, so the Friday mosque. So there are four kinds of mosques Muslims have. There's Masjid, which is for everyday prayer, so which is like around each residential area. There's a Jama Masjid, which is like a Friday mosque like this. There's an Eidgah, which is like an open mosque, just a wall facing west or towards Makkah, and then open courtyard. These are generally in the outskirts of the city, and these are for yearly congregations on special festivals, so that thousands and thousands can be accommodated. Now the fourth category is called Khanqah, which is many Muslims don't accept it as a mosque because it is to a different sect within Islam called Sufis. Have you heard about Sufis? Sufis was a kind of movement which started as a protest movement against Islam. It kind of offered simplified way of uniting with the God. It was against ostentatious display, or it was against rituals. It was against the clergy which was controlling the religion. So what it teaches is just pray to God in whatever way you want, and you can unite with the God. Be good to other humans who are the creation of the same God. That's what they said. So their worship places are called Khanqahs, Sufis. So these are the four kinds of mosques. This is a mosque which was built in 1650s. It took 6 years or so for completion. It is supposed to be India's largest mosque and can accommodate 25,000 people. Do you think so? Can it accommodate 25,000? That's what they say.
It's bigger than the one in Lahore. This one is?
No, within India.
Oh, okay.
Within India, I'm talking about. Not in the world.
Okay.
But in India, it is the largest mosque, and it was construction was started in 1650s. It was instituted by the then Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan I spoke about, who shifted the capital from Agra to Delhi in 1639. So he needed a mosque here. So this is what he built. Shah Jahan was the most prolific of all the emperors India has ever seen in the last 2,000 years or so. Mosque, the Red Fort, the Taj Mahal you are going to see in Agra, and a lot of other grand structures in the 17th century were instituted by him. Because it was a stable kingdom, it was the richest kingdom in those times, so this is what he indulged in, building these grand monuments, so kind of immortalized his name. So as I said, this took 6 years or so for completion. Yeah, so that's on this side is the wall facing west or towards Makkah. So in India it's always towards west. In US it's towards east. So depending which direction you are, so a mosque would always have a wall like this. So you can have half an hour here. By my watch, it's 2 o'clock.
Andiamo.
Always talk in time, how much time it's going to take. And even when we say time, we always say add a condition depending upon the traffic situation.
Section is for auto parts.
Well, there's a question about who dominates the gold or jewelry industry in India. It's actually the Jains, the Jain community in India. The auto spares market here is dominated by Sikhs and Muslims actually, who has to fix if there's some problem. Looks almost impossible, but they do it in few minutes time. They're so good. Now we are running a huge deficit in the country as far as electricity is concerned. Between peak demand and supply, there's a gap of almost 25-30%, especially in summers, May, June, which are the hottest months. Theft and transmission losses also. So there was a survey recently that said almost 15-20% of the electricity is lost to theft and these transmission distribution losses.
So they have brownouts?
Although talking about this area here, just hanging like that, the reason being there's a fight between the Delhi Electricity Board and the Municipal Corporation. Electricity Board says it's their responsibility to remove them, and Electricity Department says it's the Municipal Corporation's job to do that. They've done their job by laying underground wires. So many of them are like just hanging like that, these pillars, and you burn out power cuts during peak demand, yes, especially during summer months, it's really tough. Daily, it's not so bad, maybe 3 hours or 4 hours in a day for almost 2.5 months. No sign of police, yeah? Maybe taking a nap or having a cup of chai. There's a question about education in India, school education, and is it compulsory to send kids to school? Well, it wasn't. Few years back, after debating it for almost 30-40 years in the parliament, a bill was cleared which makes education compulsory between the age of 6 to 16. We are facing. Generally speaking, Indian families attach a lot of importance to education, but there are still a lot of families where even the kids are working and they're running. And the other community is Muslims. We don't have uniform civil code in the country. Talking about all the other religions, be it Hinduism, Jainism, Christianity, generally it's 2 kids norm, but amongst Muslims it's a major concern because they still think adopting any kind of birth control measure is against the wishes of Allah. That's a huge problem we are facing. It's leading to a huge problem in the country, kind of conflict. Where some Hindu religious leaders are saying the way Muslims are growing. They came out with an interesting survey. Recently they said in 1950s, Muslims were just 4.5% of the total population. Now they're 14%. And they came up with interesting solution. They said all Hindu mothers should have at least 4 children. They've been talking 50 odd million people. That becomes politically. It's 12 hours in a day, it's rush hour here. It would be much faster to walk through this chaos, I guess, isn't it? What are these red color cylinders on the right hand side on a rickshaw? Do you see them? Red color cylindrical containers. LPG. So we supply them to homes basically for the stoves, cooking. All the distribution companies are state owned. Getting ready for afterlife. So a kilo of raw chicken would cost you around $6, and goat would be like $8 or maybe $9. There's a lot of feeding. There's a question about That's amazing. I've had the chance of working with few photographers who love people photography. So I've done lots of walks in this area. At times you enter this small little house, just one room. You knock at the door, then he opens the door and they're like one by one, 7, 8 young kids coming out. How they live there. Offering.
The money
You can
changer.
take out our dollars and pass them on through the window, and he says he also accepts some dry fruits being sold on the left hand side, all imported from Gulf. Question about a gentleman who has dyed his hair red with henna. Anybody has a clue? Especially the older men dyeing their hair with henna instead of a hair color. And especially amongst the Muslims actually. Why? Well, the answer is Muslims, after completing the pilgrimage to Mecca, they start coloring their hair in this color because apparently Paigambar, Prophet Muhammad, used to use henna. He was against using this hair dyes, black hair dyes, to differentiate. So he propagated the use of henna. So once they've done the pilgrimage, they start using henna to feel closer to the Prophet. But they've done the pilgrimage, which is like must do once in a life for them. Some snacks being sold on the right hand side. Deep fried chicken tikkas, pakoras. They make a wheat flour dough, put the chicken pieces into it and then deep fry in oil. Not very healthy but very tasty. It's generally mustard oil actually. Oh, you can relax now. Phew, yeah, we have made it almost. The worst part of the street actually we have. Oh, there's yet to come some more chaos. But it should be easy.
Looking out the back of the bus.
Any dignitaries, foreign dignitary coming to
Like Ashes Park.
और भी काम करने पे हो तो और जब तुम ये तुम नहीं ना होती फोटो खींच रहे, ये माला ले जाए सारा का सारा।
So you have 15 minutes here to walk around. That's a ritual bathing, washing tank he was the Sikh gentleman there was talking about. You can see people taking a dip or washing their hands or feet before visiting the temple. So you can walk around here. 15 minutes we assemble here. Then we would be going to the community dining and kitchen area. And that's always for me the most interesting part. That's really kind of a humbling experience, how, people of all ages, all colors, all sexes, they're sitting there, and it's an amazing experience. So 15 minutes, it's 9:35 by my watch, so 9:50. Well, talking about Sikhism, it was more like a protest movement which started in the middle of 15th century as a reaction against some of the problems with both Hinduism and Islam. Hindus were a divided society. They were like caste system. They used to worship thousands of gods. The priest class, the clergy class called Brahmins were controlling the religion, and it was becoming difficult for the common folk to be really able to pray, and they were a confused lot. So that's how Sikhism movement started. It is nothing but a simplified version of Hinduism. All the Sikh Guru said was, you don't have to pray in a particular way to reach salvation. You don't have to go through priests or clergy to be able to be close to the God. All human beings, all living beings are creation of the same supreme God. So there cannot be any distinction based on birth. So there's no caste system, he said. Everyone is equal, whether you're a Sikh, a Hindu, a Muslim, you're equal in front of the God. So that's a simple message they gave, and that's it about Sikhism.
Saffron is color which is sacred, devoted to both the Hindus and the Sikhs. Saffron for us represents sacrifice, self-abnegation. That's why this saffron color. And on top there is that's saffron. That color. Yeah. This is saffron. On top is a small flag with this Sikh symbol, and on top of the flag you can see that's the Sikh weapon. They call it khadag, or kind of knife or dagger actually. That's what it represents. Where's the dagger? On top of the flag, you see that shape? Yeah. That's in the form of a dagger. Sikh weapon. Yeah. So.
저쪽에서 사진 찍은 차는 들고 오세요.
양 밖에요? It's all over the world where more and more I'm coming to see. It's just somebody to help them cope with life.
Dining hall, dining area to you. This is where all the food which is being prepared there, maybe in half an hour or so they'll start serving the meal, the morning meal. So people come in batches here. 100 people or so are allowed in one go. They would come and sit on the floor. They lay down a carpet. They eat. In 15 minutes they have to leave. Then the next batch comes in. It's pretty much 24-hour kitchen. On an average, they feed around 10,000 people daily. And on weekends, the number can go up to 20, 25,000. And on specific days in a year, which is like Sikh festivals, it could go up to 40, 50,000 people also. So all volunteers, the whole kitchen is run on donations only.
Just wait right here.
Yeah, you can
I'll
sit
look
here.
around a little bit.
Okay.
I'll come back.
Okay,
If you're coming back this
yeah,
way.
we are going to stay here 15 minutes, so whenever you feel tired, you can sit here. So walk around, take pictures. You can also help them there, participate in the service there. You want to do it, do you think? Come here, yeah. You can sit with her. Join her. You're not trying your hand?
I know I want, well I would, but I want to take a picture.
I'll do that. Judy, you want me to take a picture? You want me to take a picture?
May I try my hand as well?
Yeah, why not? Wherever you
Can I
find
just sit on the floor here? I'm comfortable on the floor, right?
But you can do that. Yeah.
Can you take my picture
Yeah,
too?
sure.
But with 1912 is the password.
Okay.
But can you get so with the
Okay.
background?
Okay.
Is this bread they're making?
Yeah. So if this gets picked up, then they bake it on the grill there, you see?
Yeah.
All these go there
Okay.
on the fire and then they're ready. Some rice and lentils, you can see the thing they prepare large cauldron. So there's generally a lentil, which is black or yellow lentil, and seasonal vegetable. And at the last is a dessert called semolina pudding.
Oh, yeah, I know semolina.
Yeah.
Come down and see. Everyone's a volunteer.
Oh yeah, all of them were volunteers. Yeah. Rotis and seasonal vegetable. Dessert called kadha, which is like semolina pudding. So let's slowly make our way out.
Yesterday we drove north, today we are going to drive south. And it's a very important site called Qutub Minar, which marks the victory of Islam over Hinduism. That's a spot where the last of the powerful Hindu emperor, Prithviraj Jahan, was defeated in late 12th century by an Afghan ruler who came from a small principality called Ghur, Muhammad of Ghur. And for next 600 years there were like 7 different Muslim dynasties who ruled a country in succession. Then British finished the domination of Islam again in 18th century. In 1947 we became an independent nation. These kids belong to a nomadic tribe called Nuts. That's a Hindi word, not the English nuts, but Nuts. They used to be professional entertainers in the older times, kind of who would do acrobatic stuff like this, tightrope walking and other things. Unfortunately, gypsies lost relevance now, but they're still not part of the mainstream because they were like nomadic tribes. They still don't have any ID proofs and stuff, so they can't buy properties and things. So in slums you don't buy or sell property actually. It's more like just squatters.
Little historical background. I did mention earlier, yesterday, that although the excavations carried out in this area points towards human settlements in this area from 6th century BC onwards, but it was actually from 12th century onwards really this area really rose to prominence because of its strategic location along the north, south and east-west corridor of the country. And the last of the powerful Hindu dynasty, Jahan dynasty, the last powerful Mughal emperor, Hindu emperor, Prithviraj Chauhan, ruled from this very area. So this used to be a human settlement in 12th century, and in late 12th century, 1192 to be precise, was like amongst the first of the Islamic invasions in the country. There was a province called Ghur, which falls in what is now Afghanistan. The name of the emperor there was Muhammad. So Muhammad of Ghur attacked this area in that year, 1192. The local ruler here, Prithviraj Jahan, a Rajput from the warrior clan, in the first battle, first invasion, defeated Muhammad Ghur. But he was a great chivalrous king, and Muhammad Ghur asked for forgiveness, laid down his arms and weapons and said, "I'm sorry and forgive me, I won't do that again." And the great king he was, for Hindu warriors, you never attack someone asking for forgiveness or somebody who doesn't have weapons. So he actually forgave him. Although Prithviraj Chauhan's father-in-law, who had supported him in this battle, he advised Prithviraj Chauhan against doing that. But Prithviraj Chauhan, the great emperor he was, he said, no, I can't harm him, I can't kill a person who is asking for forgiveness. I'll give him a chance to repent and mend his ways. So anyhow, so he forgave him. Muhammad Ghori went back, and within a year he regrouped. He had his spy network, he identified the weaknesses and attacked again. Prithviraj Chauhan, his father-in-law, refused to support him, and this time, that's what happens when you don't listen to your in-laws. So in this battle, Prithviraj Chauhan was defeated. He was captured, taken to Afghanistan and killed ultimately. But this is the site which marks, in a way, victory of Islam over Hinduism, and this site marks the beginning of Islamic rule in India, which continued for next 500-600 years actually. Yeah, so this is very much the site, and because they were Islamic rulers, so they wanted to build a mosque, first of the Muslims, and they didn't have the artisans. It was just an army who had come in, and they were like, it's believed 26 Jain and Hindu temples in this area. So what they did was quickly demolish those temples, use the pillars of those temples, Hindu and Jain temples, and selected this mosque actually. I think you would know in Islamic architecture, any representation of living form is strictly prohibited. But in Hindu temples, Hindu and Jain temples, you always have carvings on the pillars of gods or animals which are like vehicles of these gods. So what they did was quickly deface them. So if you look at the pillars, you would see faces where noses and eyes have been chopped off. When I say deface, basically they just rubbed it and chopped them off actually. So all around, if you see, all the faces you would see, they've chopped off those. And these kind of plain pillars, wherever you see, they're like the fresh ones because it has fallen apart. So Archaeological Survey of India just placed a fresh kind of rock here to give it support actually, so that you can identify which is original and which is the newer one. So all the pillars around with beautiful carvings, they are part of the original Hindu and Jain temples, which were just dismantled and created this mosque here. So this was the first mosque in North India in a way. And look at the minarets right there, which was kind of victory tower built by the same dynasty which we call Ghur or slave dynasty. What happened was Muhammad of Ghur, after defeating the local emperor, installed his slave as the governor of this area and went back to Afghanistan. It used to be pretty common in those times. These kings never used to install their brothers or sons because ultimately they'll take over, and so they used to appoint their slaves who were like very successful warriors and had served them for years very loyally. So he established his slave as the governor of this province, but as soon as Muhammad Ghori went back, he passed away in 2-3 years time. So this slave here, governor, he declared independence and he kind of appointed him the king or emperor of this area. So that's why this dynasty is also referred to as slave dynasty. So slave dynasty started the rule from here, and they erected the structure as a kind of victory tower. The name of the slave was Qutubuddin Aibak. So it's called Qutub Minar, or the minaret of Qutubuddin. Supposed to be the tallest brick minaret in the world. It's almost 70 meters tall actually. Then after maybe 7-8 years or so, they erected this here. So by that time they had settled here. So they had artisans from Afghanistan or maybe from Bukhara, Uzbekistan. Well, that was the area where these artisans used to be in those times. So they used to pay these kings a lot of money to these people. So probably they came here and they created that. So you can see inscriptions from Quran which are carved out on red sandstone. The top 2 stories that fallen off due to the thunder, the electricity. What do you call it? Lightning. I'm sorry, lightning. So they were replaced. So those are the marble one. The top 2 stories have marble, but in 12th and 13th century they never used to use marble. So it was one of the later dynasties who resurrected the top 2 stories and they built them in marble. Example of India's metallurgical skills. That's an iron pillar which dates back to 5th century. It was almost 100 years before Chinese discovered iron actually. 5 tons in weight. It has not rusted till now. How they created this kind of structure actually. They used a technique called forged welding. Where you keep lumps of iron one on top of another at very high temperature. You hammer it actually, so that's how you get the shape. So that's how tall it is. Nobody really knows from where it came from, but it was one of the Muslim emperor who brought it from some other part of the country and had it installed here. But there's some inscriptions on the pillar which are in a language called Prakrit, which is kind of a very ancient language in India. And the references to one of the kings, they point to Gupta dynasty, which ruled the country from 5th and 6th century, which is regarded as a golden time period in the history of India, and it saw huge revival of Hinduism around that time. So inscriptions on it point towards, it's like the middle of late 4th or the middle of 15th century. That's the time frame when it was must have been made here. 1,600 years old, and it has not rusted till now. So now you have it's 11:20, so 40 minutes to wander around. You can walk around here. There are lots of old ruins. Later dynasties also who ruled this area, they created their own this structure. There was a religious school called Madrasa around this side. There's a beautiful tomb of one of the slave emperor called Iltutmish and white marble there. On this side you see unfinished kind of tower like this, which is just like first story. There was another dynasty who ruled this area called Khaljis, and the emperor there then decided to have a minaret built which would be double the height of this, but he could never achieve that. As soon as they started constructing, he passed away. Future generations were not interested in carrying forward his ambition, so that's what it is there.
दिखा करके लेते इंसान तुम जितना रहा हम लोग का चेहरा देखो ना, छोड़ो बैकग्राउंड। छोड़ो 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 चलो अंदर हो। उधर निकलना है कहाँ आ गया चाचा तेरा। सिंगापुर कितना जोरा गई क्या
सही है
That's why I take just a few little pictures, because I mean, what am I going to do with all this stuff?
If you remember, I said there were 8 different dynasties who ruled India the last 1,000 years or so, 800 to be precise. So all 8 dynasties founded their imperial city or capital city within this city of Delhi. So New Delhi was the last one, which was founded by the British. For first 150 years, British ruled from Calcutta, which is on the eastern coast. So towards late 19th century, there was a realization that the need to shift the capital to a more strategic location, because Calcutta is on the eastern front. So Delhi is much more strategic, and plus it has been the imperial city for so long, the political, financial center of the country for so long. So it made it more logical or practical to rule from Delhi, and even the whole population would only accept them as the true rulers of the country if they rule from Delhi. That was the thought process behind it, actually. So that's how in 1911 there was a darbar, the first of the English monarchs visited India. There was a large function which was held in 1911, King George V. So the capital was shifted from Calcutta to Delhi. So they picked up a site which was like a cluster of villages. So they had to acquire the land, flatten it, and then build the whole city from scratch. But the actual work on building the city started from 1918, because in between there was World War I, so they couldn't do anything. The energies were diverted towards that. So between 1918 to 1931, the city was built. 1931 is the year when the city was inaugurated as a new imperial city.
Good morning.
Well, I guess we can't walk, so we're taking this. What would you call this? A jitney or?
quick picture if you want to.
Okay.